My name is Lynn Wells, and I'd like to welcome you to the 14th Annual TIDES Capabilities Demonstration. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sara Cobb, who is the Drucie French Cumbie Professor at the Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at the George Mason University. Sara will be talking to us today about the very important topic of narrative and storytelling. Welcome, Sara.
There are, I would say, two big domains of skills that would be useful and that, I think are central to working in communities. And one has to do with narrative practice. And that practice includes a set of, guidelines for how do you do inquiry. For instance, you never ask linear questions or strategic questions. Those would be questions where you're asking people to designate the cause of something or provide an explanation. That would be a linear question, or a strategic question is a leading question of, don't you think that, you rather ask reflective questions, which call for people to account for their own experience of things, to share their perceptions of things, to give you relational knowledge about how they see other people seeing things. So those are reflective questions. And then there's a fourth category called circular questions. And circular questions are kind of a form of gossip that you do in public in front of people, where you're asking people to share their view of other people's views. And then people can start talking about how their views are different and they didn't know, things that they discover in the course of those conversations. So I think one big domain for practice has to do with the kind of questions you ask, and we have guidelines for that. We have a series of other tools that I don't need to go into now, but just trust me, they're there. They're called externalization. There's one called scaffolding. And then there's, routine conversational tools called positive connotation and negative explanation, et cetera. And these are all things that we train our students to do, either in small group conversations or one-on-one. Let's say you're talking to a leader, a mayor or something like that, about what they think needs to happen, or with groups. So I believe that CRASC would be so interesting to set up some workshops in communities where these tools like externalization and scaffolding could be applied. And basically what they do, Lynn, is ask people, enable people to take their story as object and then take increasing distance on it themselves through a series of questions, through a process that enable them to deconstruct it and look at what's really important to them. So these are wonderful tools. Also, I wanted to comment that all of this is important, particularly important, because many of the communities that probably CRASC is operating in or would operate in have been exposed to trauma, either natural disaster or, as you said, we know, in man-made disaster as well. So understanding how to do, for instance, something called life review interviews. And these are interviews that you do where you actually engage people in the story of suffering they have and help them knit that back into a broader storyline about their lives. You can do that in workshop settings or individual settings. Now that's all in the domain of practice. The second domain I think that's needed is the domain of research, because simply going into a community and interviewing a few people may or may not yield, depends on who you're interviewing, may not yield a description of the landscape of narratives that are involved here. So you have to think of narrative as a system. This landscape operates as a system, and there will be polarities in that system. And it's critical to make sure that I always ask the snowball question at the end of an interview: who could I talk to that would agree with you, what you've told me? And then who could I talk to that would disagree with you? And I sort of carry out my interviews and my data collection along those. I find the poles, I find the polarities, and I start interviewing along those lines. And we have a lot of tools for narrative analysis. Some of them are wonderful to help. There's one called Kuma, which is a tool that actually enables people to come together and look together at a description of the narrative landscape that we might provide. And they say yes, no, up, down, right, left. This is how all these things are hooked together. So that we end up with them engaged in the analysis of their own narrative landscape, which is super interesting. So I think we've got a lot of research and tools and also practice tools to help with the mission, with the StarTides and the CRASC mission.
Now, do these work effectively across cultures and languages? If you were doing this in the Middle East, say, how would you have to modify these approaches?
I think that there are always cultural variations. First, let me say, narrative is ubiquitous. It crosses all culture and it operates similarly. There are different rules about how, different social and cultural rules and norms about what sort of stories can be told in public, and who can ask the questions. For instance, in some cultures, as a woman, it would be untoward to have a woman asking questions. Now, Lynn, you know me well enough to know I don't mind being untoward, so I can pretty much ingratiate myself with just about anybody. And I found it's, all cultures seem to be open to this kind of inquiry. I do think, again, there might be social norms that would need to be respected around who asks the questions, who convenes the groups. And in some cultures, that should be men, not women, perhaps, just to abide by the social norms and standards. But I think the team obviously could include women that could get to know groups of people. And again, this is the case when you're doing any kind of cross-cultural work, you have to be sensitive to this. But the narrative operates similarly across cultures. It has the same components and the similar processes surrounding trauma, for instance. And this process of, for instance, getting degrees of distance from the storylines helps people reflect and share information rather than be embedded in them. So, and I would say the last thing I would say is in all conflicts and problems, which is where I live, are manifest and materialized in stories that themselves do not want to be altered. So there is a property called narrative closure that is organizing to keep narratives the same. So that's why conflicts are often intractable. And that's why communities might lose hope. And then the story about what's going on in the community is going to be a story of hopelessness. So any effort to change those stories or support their development is going to be met with degrees of resistance independent of culture. So the trick is, and the task is, to engage people in a way that would open those stories in a respectful and ethical fashion.
So what's an example of a closed narrative that actually was open through somebody?
I'm sorry, Lynn, I didn't hear the question, pardon me?
The question, what is an example of a closed narrative that actually was opened through these kind of tools? I was listening to a discussion about Jerusalem the other day, and people were talking about the merits of Palestinian versus Israeli, whatever. And someone came in and said, this land was given to us by God 2,000 years ago, and no politician is going to take that away from us. That's a pretty closed narrative, I think. So how do you open some of these?
Well, I think that first place, there's no magic bullet, right? That's the important thing because you're working with people and stories. I think that you had to pick probably the most difficult, quintessentially difficult, intractable conflict on the planet. But I've been to Israel a couple of times, invited by the State Department and working with groups there. And what I found is a lot of openness, to listening and hearing the views of others. Doesn't mean people are going to change policies necessarily, but I think the more we move, or the more narrative practitioners and interveners move in the direction of engagement, which is never the dismissal. It doesn't begin with the dismissal of a narrative, because once a narrative, considers you an antibody, once you're a virus to the narrative, it generates its own antibodies and nothing's going to change. And I think a lot of the conversations that go on about the Middle East and in the Middle East are attacking narratives. They're stories that call for change. And that's not the way you begin. You begin with developing understanding, which usually helps the people who hold these stories stand under their own narratives, which is a play on words there. But if the process is good, it may not lead to ta-da change. It may be, because the change model we're working with, I imagine, in StarTIDES as well as CRASC, is an evolutionary model. It's not a state change from this to that. It's the development of social systems and, you know, and the infrastructure that goes with that in a way that allows people to engage, and that means meaning changes happen over time and not instantly. Did I escape the question adequately?
No. So are these skills basically covered in normal academic disciplines? How many universities offer courses in narrative and storytelling and these kind of things?
We have, what happens is these practices transferred from more counseling and therapeutic psychological frames, right? And so they're not in many, for instance, I believe there are about 75 conflict resolution programs in the country, the United States, and they're about in 2 of them. So our school, the Carter School, is, you know, internationally known for its work on narrative, and we're delighted to be a resource for Mason, for CRASC, for other, you know, other folks that are going on. And when I met you, Lynn, I was absolutely, you know, stumbling around with delight, giggling for a long time after that, thinking, wow, you know, we can really hook up with engineers and others who are working in communities, and to bring some of this expertise that we have to real life cases, which is, you know, wonderful.
Right, and then of course we find that it's always harder to actually bridge those gaps in reality, even if you have the theoretical basis for it. But so if they're not in normal academic disciplines, what would be the incentive, say, to get into 3 or 4 of those conflict resolution curricula across the country? Well, how would you put in a tenure track, or how would you put in the kind of things to make it attractive?
Well, I think that these narrative practices, you know, they're very, very central to the psychological or counseling or, you know, helping professions. The question is how to get them out, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what we're working on, you know, in our school. I do think that, you know, for instance, I'd be happy to give workshops to engineers. Yeah. On, you know, how do you design a meeting? How do you run what kinds of questions you would ask? You know, how would you, you know, organize for the sort of conversations that would support narrative transformation. And Lynn, having met you a while ago, I have no doubt that you'd be an expert in this.
Well, I'd certainly like to try to.
Yeah, I'd love to provide this. So I think, can I make a comment, Lynn? Yeah. I think that there's different levels of narrative practice, right? Mm-hmm. So at the more advanced level, which I'm talking to you about, there are more specific tools, and there's literature behind it, and there's research behind it and all that. But, you know, there's also a folk approach to narrative, which is just normal people, and you do this, and we do it with our families and friends and colleagues all the time. We ask for people, tell us what's going on. And that's a normal folk question that allows us to elicits the stories that people have, and simply independent of people's capacity for, you know, this advanced narrative practice, everybody has capacity to listen to other people's stories. So this is a sort of a ubiquitously available tool
around the campfire.
Yeah, and in meetings and, you know, everything else. I do think we oftentimes charge into, you know, us in the West and the North of the world, of the planet, often charge into situations thinking we know the solution, right? And you're with your charts and everything, as you mentioned earlier.
So you mentioned the things like holding workshops for engineers and all that. The question here is, how do you bridge the cultural gaps between citizens and the technical community? And I mean, we're unfortunately seeing a period at least in the U.S. now, of sort of a suspicion of expertise, I guess. Right. Not to mention expertise in general, but scientific expertise in particular. Right. And so, given where we are now, I understand the point about working within George Mason or within the engineering department to build, but how do you build in the society as a whole, build back to a sense that say, gee, maybe some people who've studied this for a long time and have some ideas should not be just thrown out because they have that expertise?
Yeah, I think that, you know, there's some interesting examples I know of great work that's being done. For instance, in the Savannah, there's a sea level rise project that's engaged the community, and they've got sea level sensors. The schools are involved. They've got, you know, mayor and the council and homeowners involved. And what one guy's doing, he's from Georgia Tech. I can't remember his name, but I can get that to you. He's putting these maps of the region down to the community, and people are telling stories about, you know, what's going on in the community. And the other people that are gathered there are engineers and other people who, you know, who would have something to do with the development of the land or what it needs to mitigate the effects of climate change. So that sort of collaborative gathering around maps, I think, is a great way to initiate a set of conversations that would include these transdisciplinary, you know, different disciplines. The second example is I worked with the EPA for a while in Superfund sites, and I studied the way in which they integrated this technical with the social aspects of the communities. And oh my gosh, you know, they really stepped on their own feet several times. And what I talked to them about, my recommendation was to set up some graphic visuals that really told the story of what was going to happen in the community. That would be a storyline, because everybody understands a story. So we're going to do this. First, there was this kind of problem, and then we thought about it and we sort of came up with this sort of idea. Now we're going to do this, etc. So as long as things are in a storyline, communities can understand it. It's when technical information sits outside of a narrative arc that people struggle with it. So that would be one recommendation I have, and I think we could get a lot better at that kind of visualization.
I heard a really interesting story from someone around Santa Barbara a few years ago, and they had a prolonged drought. And the issue is how did you get people to change their water use patterns, don't water your lawn, things like that. And the normal governance processes of you know, ticketing people or, you know, beating them up or whatever wasn't working. And what this lady did was she came in and she put together a story that actually had overhead imagery of the reservoir levels and just showed them dropping and dropping and dropping. And within, you know, just a few weeks of displaying those, you say, within the narrative arc, scientific data, but displayed in a way that could resonate with people, it had a big impact.
Great idea. Were they posted around like billboards, or what were they?
I honestly don't know. She just said she introduced them in. I don't know whether they were town halls where you use slides or.
Really interesting. Yeah, I think it's great. And again, it's part of the story, and that's what we're really talking about, is translating technical information. And it's not even translating. It's embedding technical information inside of a storyline, or using technical information to tell the story. So I think it's, you know, I think that it's you're prescient, Lynn, in my view, because you're thinking about this kind of integration, and I think it's really timely and innovative and completely cutting edge.
Thank you. One of the sort of sound bites I've developed myself over time is that sociology always tops technology.
Yeah.
And that, you know, no matter how good your technology is, if you don't get the human bond, you're not going to get it implemented. But I'm wondering, is this always true? I mean, are there not some cases where, you know, the sea level rise, or the intensity of the storms, or when your river catches on fire or something like that, where there's not such a compelling technological case that really people are kind of forced to accept that they've got to change something?
Well, you know, there's a lot more that goes. I would disagree with that. I don't think any technology can replace the importance of actually building relationships and being with people around the things they're worried about and they're suffering from. So, for instance, I'm working in the Arctic right now, in Utqiagvik, which is in the north, right on the North Slope. And one of the things the residents are hollering about is they've got flooding, they have sea level rise, they have melting permafrost, they got all kinds of problems. But if you try to put a bunch of engineers in there to solve the problem, first you have to sit and listen to the traditional knowledge of what they've already learned, how they've handled these things in the past, some of the issues they have about being left aside, the worries for the technology that's being, integrated or proposed. So I think that that's a good example of the fact that any outside intervention is embedded inside of, an ongoing group of groups of people that have relationships in history and culture. And unless you can build those connections first, and then they participate in the design of solutions, there's no way that any kind of technical intervention is going to win the day. And in Utqiagvik, one of the things that's really important is the technicians, the people who have the scientific information, or engineers or scientists. They really want to solve the problem immediately. And what makes the people of Utqiagvik so upset is the fact that their traditional knowledge is undervalued. Mm. And that traditional knowledge is applied in Savannah, or wherever we are. There are people that are living with problems, and they need to be the first speakers. They need to be honored as, okay, we're going to understand this from your perspective, even if in our back pocket we've done this 16 times and we know the kinds of solutions we might have. You still have to go through the process of engaging people where they are, I think. But that's my, I'm a narrative specialist, so of course I'm going to answer that way.
So beyond bridging the technical gaps, this shifts to within a community when you have underserved parts. Right. You may have the same technical or climate or whatever problems, but right. One part of the community is inherently disadvantaged versus another. So how does the narrative change between the privileged and the underprivileged part when facing more or less the same problem?
Well, one of the important things, and I'll talk about the project that you and I are, working on together at CRASC in a second. But one of the things that's typical or particular to underserved populations, quote unquote, vulnerable, precarious people, is the fact that they may not have narratives that are well formed. Huh. In other words, they're busy dealing with the pressures of day-to-day life. And they have not had optics, haven't had chance, nobody's asked them to step back and make sense of anything. That's one problem. The second is that violence and trauma and suffering actually reduce the capacity for storytelling. They interrupt the formation of a narrative. So if you look at trauma healing, what we're trying to do is help people make a story and then be able to take it as an object and make sense of it with other people. Well, if you don't have that space for making a story and having it be an object of reflection and consideration, you are the story. You don't have a story. So I think in addition to all the other, complexities of working with vulnerable populations, the storytelling process of sitting and listening and helping people describe what it is that's going on with them is absolutely ever more critical. And I think that requires some kind of long-term relationship because, I might be able to float into a community of people who are not precarious and are not vulnerable and, have some meetings, have some workshops, and, people are ready to have me come and go, and they're going back to their lives in the interim, and they come back and join together. But in a vulnerable population, there's so much distrust for outsiders. There's, that's amplified. Trauma amplifies that kind of fear and distrust and anxiety. So all the more reason to have very, very stable, connections with the communities. And that often requires, people that are already part of the communities to be used as intermediaries. So you can't, I wouldn't just, right now, you and I are working on the project of cybersecurity and how vulnerable populations experience that. And we're having to work through intermediaries because we can't even get to them.
Right, right.
And they don't know us, or so we're talking to food banks and shelters, the staff that actually know the people, and we're going to have to build relationships with them in order to be able to talk to other folks. So
one of the things we found in Appalachia was that the people, who had some trust the community, because the community's been lied to for so long by so many.
Yes.
is that young people who had left and then gone off somewhere to study and then had chosen to come back
Wow.
had credibility. And the other were faith-based groups.
Nice. Nice.
Those are the two.
Nice. Well, I think you've hit on something really important that makes working with vulnerable populations distinct. And that is, you said the word, or I thought of the word betrayal, because there is, years and years, if not generations of betrayal of being, hope that things don't ever work out. It's never enough and nobody cares. So I think, working on top of those narratives, working on top of that experiences requires time and investment and stability in the relationship. So those are my thoughts on that.
So final question, there's talk about integrating art and design into STEM, and science, technology, engineering, math, education. And this is sometimes talked about as terms of STEAM. Adding.
Yeah.
So do art and design in this case become another form of narrative and storytelling, or is that sort of something qualitatively different?
No, I think it's wonderful. I think there are all kinds of ways for people to represent, what it is that they're caring about. And there's an entire methodology called Photovoice, and it involves giving cameras to people, and they take pictures of what's important to them. Let's say, you're working in a community that's been hit by a natural disaster, and they take pictures of what's important to them. Or, I had a student working in Bosnia about that, around the conflict, historical situation there, the history of violence in the community. And the women went around taking pictures because the powers that be, the UN and international NGOs want more women involved in peace building and peacemaking. So they usually add women in stir, right? They just get some workshops and get the women in the workshops and they're done. But what my student wanted to do was try to get the perspectives of women on their own role in peace building. And so she gave them cameras and they did a phenomenal job, not only taking the picture, but then telling a story underneath it about why it was important to them. And there was a couple of exhibits of that, one here in DC and one in Bosnia. So that's just an example. I mean, I think there's a wonderful role that art can play. Just one other comment on that is that, theater has been widely used in reconciliation processes. So you can find a peace agreement, but then theater comes along and builds, enables community members to enact the stories of what's happened and to tell a different story in the course of the play. And, or soap operas. There's been a lot of work in the NGO world developing soap operas and these very, hot, intractable conflicts where people can watch and the issues play out in the lives of the characters. So I think there's a lot of room for us to use art and theater and photography and, every other kind of art, including music. Yeah.
Sarah, thank you for an absolutely fascinating conversation, and look forward to continuing very much in our other interactions and see if we can expand this thinking to other more technical disciplines.
Well, I would really enjoy that, and it's wonderful to have a collaborator like you from this other world for me. So I thank you for including me. It's very nice.
My pleasure. Take care. Thank you very much.